Let's start again. I'm going to clap. Okay, here we go. So you want to be a programmer?
That's what it looks like.
Yeah. You're not new to programming though, right?
No, I have some experience back in the 90s. I was doing some work for my company
Mm-hmm.
and, did a lot of catering for Microsoft. So they set me up with, I started programming a database for an operating system for my catering business that I did a lot of catering for Microsoft.
Mm.
And they set me up with kind of some books back in the day. It wasn't like the internet now.
Mm-hmm.
But it was Visual Basic, and Microsoft Access. So I used Microsoft Access for the forms and customized it and wrote the back end in
Mm.
Visual Basic.
And it was you took to it, right? I mean, you understood what you were doing.
Yeah. So what is it? It was a relationship
Yeah,
database.
relational databases. Yeah.
And like I said, I don't know a lot of the terms. I kind of just made it up as I go along. And so, the workflow with it is kind of mechanically, I feel like from, a production manager in maybe software engineering, that might be something where I end up going with
Mm.
all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I want to have a good working knowledge of, the basics of programs so I can explain that to people or,
Yeah.
but the immediate goal really is, I come up with so many, I have so many small business solutions that I'd want to take on. And, I don't necessarily have the time or want to spend the resources on hiring a software developer to write an app that could potentially take, a
Yeah.
couple hours, and
Right.
so, and they're not big enough programs. It's just, temporary solutions that help
Right.
me with my personal workflow.
So you're a
So
businessman who wants to use programs and write programs to help you do your job, basically.
yeah,
Yeah.
automation, just efficiency.
Mm.
I end up using so many apps that I can't customize. And so
Right.
I find I'm using like 4 different apps to solve something and
Yeah.
then it becomes inefficient. So
Yeah. And so, a case in point is Robert has these racing rigs. So they're virtual racing rigs. So he's got three of them. There's a seat and a shifter and a steering wheel and a big wraparound screen, and people can race against each other. But they're essentially Windows boxes. And he wanted a way to bring all of the scores after a race together and then create a leaderboard. And so they didn't have this option. And I just wrote a Windows Forms program basically for him. And, he's still using it. And it's a pretty simple program, but it solves a problem.
yeah.
So what do you know about programming? Like, can you give me the sum total of things that you do know or you think you know?
So I know you need a computer.
Good. That's a good
You,
start.
you need to have half a brain.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty much good to go on the computers,
Right.
the brain side of it. So I don't really, I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah.
Like when we sat through the programming, I understand there's lines of code.
Mm.
I know that there's like segments of code. I
Mm-hmm.
know there's a protocol where you call a command and then it runs something.
Right.
And then it does an if then statement and it says, if this happens, then this
Yeah.
happens.
Right.
And it kind of just sends you in. And so I look at it more of like, for me, a diagram,
Yeah.
where it's a flow chart of boxes and with connectors.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've got to assign values, so variables.
Yeah. Variables. Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think I have a pretty good working knowledge on how it works.
But
And
you
then I
look
know,
at code and you're like, what the heck is this?
you know what? I kind of can understand what the code is.
Mm.
I think my challenge is you talk about these libraries. It's like, if I were to write a code of how to print something, hello world, and I think that's where it always starts.
Sure.
There's a code for that, and there's a command in a library that says print to screen or, you know,
Right.
enter a code or something, and then it tells you to print it. And so
Yeah.
what gets confusing with me is the language itself,
Right.
and the syntax
Yep.
on how you're supposed to do things. And I know right now you can call up and there's a lot of code from my understanding that's kind of pre-written out and then you customize that.
Right.
What I don't understand is, first the basics of the language. So, like you say, I hear terms like .NET. I'm like
Mm.
Visual Basic. I said I don't know what .NET is, or C++ or C sharp, or
Mm-hmm.
are we playing music or are we programming? You
Right.
know,
Yeah, that was
I,
the so plus plus is an operator that you can use on a numeric variable to increment it. So if you have an integer, right? If you have
yeah,
an integer and the value is
yep.
1 and the name of the variable is, my integer, you could say my integer plus plus and 1 becomes 2. So C++ plus plus is kind of a play on that where it's sort of like the next version of C, which is a very old Unix based language that everybody used back in the day.
All right.
So C++ plus plus added object orientation, which now is an everyday thing. So that's why it's funny, because plus plus is the operator to increment, or bring. It's sort of like v next.
So I think one of the big challenges that I have is you programmers almost are like name things as a joke to people who don't know what's
That's
going
right.
on.
Yeah, it's very hard to keep up. Isn't
Like,
it?
is that the serious thing?
Well,
So
what's crazy is that somebody will come up to me and say, "Hey, have you seen cucumber?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I just made a Greek salad. I put cucumbers in it, and I made some tzatziki with cucumber. What are you talking about?" So you get conversations that sound completely surreal because of all these names of things, and so
yeah,
yeah. So C sharp is interesting because that started in 2002, I think. Microsoft announced .NET version 1 in 2002, and C sharp was their new language. And so sharp is sort of the musical way to take a note and increment it by 1, right?
gotcha.
C is 1 note, and C sharp is 1 note above that, or 1 step above that. So it was an answer to Java, which was a very popular programming language and environment. And basically, the Microsoft took things they learned from Java and things they could do better, and then they got guys like from Borland, this guy from Borland who wrote Turbo Pascal, and he wrote Delphi, which is a object-oriented Pascal,
Yeah.
and he designed a lot of the language. But they got a lot of help from a lot of industry um, people, and then C sharp became a language. But I want to tell you a little bit about .NET, because the meaning of that moniker completely changed in 2005. I'm sorry, in 2015. So in 2002, Microsoft created this thing called the .NET framework and brought it to the masses. And so the .NET framework was all about programming on the Windows operating system. All right, that's really important to know. But their thing was, Java's thing was, we can write it once and run it anywhere. We can run it in a browser, we can run on Unix and Mac and Windows, and it doesn't matter. It was a cross-platform environment. And we'll talk
hmm
about that in a minute. But .NET was all about programming for Windows, but you could use a lot of different languages. Right?
hmm
So as the web became more dominant in terms of the platform that most people were programming against in the 2000s, right? The Microsoft created this version of .NET called .NET Core in 2015. In 2016. Did I say 2015 before? It was June 2016
Yeah.
they came out with it. It was initial release. The whole idea was they were going to take it cross-platform. So it wasn't just for Windows. It would compile on Windows, Mac, and Unix, and Linux rather.
Linux.
Yep. And it would also run in, they would have a version for the web, right? That ran on web servers on all these different platforms. And it really didn't, at first it was very wonky, but it wasn't until version 3.0 I would say 2.0 in 2017 that people really began to start using it in production. And then 3.0 came out in 2019, and then 5.0 came out in 2020, Now we're up to, now they just call it .NET, even though it's cross-platform. It's not tied to Windows specifically,
Yeah.
but it's a cross-platform framework. So the difference between a framework and a language is the language is the language, right? And it exists separate from the framework. The framework has all these built-in plumbing things that help you as a programmer write code that you don't have to rewrite. So there's this thing called the runtime, or the common language runtime, and you don't have to remember all these things. I'm just telling you that there's this thing when you run a program, right? When you run a program on Windows, modern Windows, it creates this memory space called a process, and you can think of it as a box in memory. Inside that process, the code can do whatever it wants, but it can't reach outside the process and talk to programs in other processes unless there are specific pathways to do that.
Yeah.
So it's protected. And I don't know if you were around. Yeah, of course you were. You were around in the 90s when we had all these global protection faults and user application errors and problems with Windows and even Windows 95. And it wasn't until Windows NT and 2000 was the first client version of Windows that was really, really stable. And that's because they figured out how to isolate those processes and completely isolate them.
Yeah.
All right. So
just let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you real quick. So like I said, I want to make sure that I'm asking a bunch of questions down here. So what I'm doing right now is trying to understand what you're talking about. And so, I mean, people watching this would sit there and be like, yeah, I get that. I get that.
Yeah.
But I want to take this also and stop you at certain points. And I hope I don't interrupt your processes.
No, I'm good.
Or your flow control.
All right, Jordy LaForge.
Right. What I do is I write down a bunch of stuff that I recognize.
Yeah.
Like that I'm like, oh my gosh, I actually kind of know what that is.
Yeah.
So runtime, I've seen that pop up a million times. And I look at it and I just kind of walk over and said, wait a minute, runtime. It's in programs. It's when I'm downloading software or something and I'm trying to customize something.
Yeah.
But I think the number one thing that I'm hearing right now is object orientation.
Yep.
And that comes back from something that I recognize from Microsoft Visual Basic.
Yeah, sure.
And that's something that I kind of gravitated towards is there's objects, and then you could define parameters around those objects to do things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so what I want to do is as we go through this is to really go and to kind of like every time you kind of start talking about something, try to really look at it from, I mean, what do they call it? Programming for dummies.
Sure.
And not so much that there are a bunch of people that are dumb, but I think that it needs to be a different approach where as you go through, I write things down because like I know what that is, but I don't know the connection.
Yeah, I was just about to connect the dots for you in this story.
Okay. Yeah.
And so if you take a native program that was written for Windows and it has no dependencies on anything but Windows, right? You run that in a process, it's running in the operating system, the operating system's calling it directly. And, if it was a C++ program, when you create a string like hello world, you have to allocate that memory and then deallocate that memory when you're done with it. Otherwise, every time you run it, it's going to, or every time you create a new string, it's going to pile up in memory, and that's called a memory leak.
So we're also talking cucumbers again.
Yeah, we're talking cucumbers.
You've got a string, which I know is
it's text.
It's basically a box. It's a text.
Yeah, it's text. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you had to do that. And then the runtime comes along, and Visual Basic had a runtime as well that isolated you from doing all that stuff. So .NET, they learned from Visual Basic and they learned from Java, and they have this runtime. So in that process, it loads this library, right? This runtime, and all of the memory management and threading and all the complex plumbing that programmers had to do, and C programmers specifically, C++ programmers, Visual Basic programmers, we never had to worry about this stuff because the VB runtime was doing all that stuff for us. We just create strings and let them go and whatever. We create whatever we want to.
Is that the framework? Is that
Yeah, so
when
this
we're
is the
getting into that?
this is the .NET framework, which really has two parts. It has the runtime, which handles all of that plumbing stuff, and then it has this library, this base class library, that has all of the code that you can call from language that does
Gotcha.
things that you don't have to do manually, right? Like finding the occurrence of a string within another string, or writing to a file, or reading from a file. Like there's a whole bunch of different, and they're separated by names. They're called namespaces. Like all the file stuff is in system.io, right? All the string stuff is in, system.text. Converting a string to a byte array, they're converting one value to another. There's so many things and thousands of things that you can do that are just baked in to the framework. And by extension, the language takes advantage of those things.
Yeah.
So that's what I was getting to, is that the common language runtime part of the .NET framework, even if it's the old .NET framework that runs on Windows only, or .NET 7, which is current, which runs everywhere, you have both of those things. You have a common language runtime and you have a base class library. So, and the objects are part of the base class library, and
Gotcha.
also part of the language. You can create your own objects. Yeah.
So I kind of get that. So I want to back up once more and just
Sure.
say, and not necessarily for me who, is very entrepreneurial and have projects that I work on that
Right.
need applications. What's the difference between what I'm doing and just trying to learn some basic coding to solve some issues versus somebody who says, wait a minute, or a young kid who says,
Yeah.
I might want to get into programming. So what are those two separate pathways that somebody can take?
They're no different. Absolutely no different. The thing is, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you what kind of program you want to write. And that's where we're going to start. And then I'll show you how to create those in Visual Studio, which is the tool of .NET programmers, or one of them anyway.
Gotcha.
And then we'll talk about some important things that you need to understand when you're coding so that you don't make silly mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and one of the other things, and I know this is just a random, it's also by design, in this learning process, if I come up with a project and say, all right, now we're going to write code, I think it's really the strategy. When I was doing Visual Basic, I would have to start over sometimes from scratch because what I programmed was inefficient.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the things that I just want to make sure that our approach is, and I don't know the words for it. Like,
Yeah.
what is it? Is it just like,
efficiency.
it's efficiency and better
There's
way
a
of
million
doing
ways
it.
to do everything, and
Yeah.
you can do things the hard way and the long way, or you can use built-in features of the language to maybe do it in one or two lines of code. So yeah.
So I'm seeing a lot of similarities between, this programming, software engineering kind of thing and what I do for my job
Yeah.
is cooking,
Right.
and
Absolutely.
food. And, there's a million ways to, do a catering event or
You got
a
it.
wedding. But, the efficient thing has to do with timing.
Yes.
It has to do with, your mise en place, getting things set up and getting organized
Everything in its place.
before you actually go in and start cooking
Yeah.
or running the program.
Yeah, it's basically analogous to having a good architecture for your
Yeah.
application before you start coding. What's actually going to happen? Can you make a flow chart? Can you diagram it out? Right? Yeah, that's absolutely a good parallel. And what is programming but a recipe?
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that, and especially through our experience, that I would love to pursue professionally is really that programming architecture.
Yeah.
And for me, it's really wireframing what the solution is. Like,
Right.
you could say I need to do this, but what are all those steps that go in between it that make it efficient? And so,
And what are the best tools for the job? And
what are the best tools for the jobs?
That can take if especially if you're inexperienced, that can be real hard. So that's why there are consultants like me who've been around the block a few times, and somebody comes and says, I want to do an application that does this. And I would ask them a bunch of questions like, how many users does it have? Does it need to be accessible from everywhere? What is there a mobile version? Is there a desktop version? Is there a web version? Like, all of these things. What do you envision? And if the customer starts saying, well, I think we ought to use this technology and that technology, I'd be like, whoa, 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 back up. I want to know what the experience should be for the user, right? You might be right, but I want to know why.
So I love that approach, but I think this also comes down to a true architect in a build out of a building. So I build out a lot of restaurants.
Yeah.
Or I've been involved in a lot of restaurants from startup.
Yep.
You got an architect that designs something, and then you've got an operator that says, this is what I need. And those two things don't always come together. And so when you're talking about somebody about writing an app and I need an app to do this, I come from the approach that's saying, well, does that help your business?
Sure.
Or what are you trying to do with your business?
Exactly.
And then I go back and say, well, here's how we can write an app or an integrated system, that ties some of the other processes together. And that's where it really all started with me, is the fact that I looked at this business that I can say structurally, this is how you build a business that works, whether it's maintaining users, whether it's creating forms and databases to manage information, that you can recall at any time. And then I go back and say, okay, well, how are you actually going to program that? I could say, well, you've got, the Microsoft or the Gmail suites or whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
And then you sit there and you're trying to customize things and you don't really have that integrated system. So that's kind of where I think this whole thing starts with, is the, and maybe that's where our next steps is in this whole series.
And we'll get to that. But I mean, I totally understand it. When you were building out RD86, you had a room. And you said, the first thing you said is, what appliances are going to be in here and what kind of power do they need, right?
Yeah.
So you needed a 220 volt outlet for your dishwasher, and you needed outlets all along the wall every 6 feet because there's going to be a lot of electricity. You even have them coming down from the ceiling. I noticed you have, cables coming down from the ceiling so you can plug in appliances and be in the middle of the room. Very smart. So that's the first step, is infrastructure. What are we going to do here, and what kind of equipment am I going to need? And I have to plan for that when I build out the room. And then you pull in the appliances that you need. Now you have to figure out where they go, right? And you have to, okay, we're going to have a rack over here. We're going to have a fridge against the wall over here. We're going to have a freezer against this wall. I'm going to have tables. And then, and all the time you're thinking about, how am I going to cook? Right? What am I going to do, and what's my process?
So one of the things that I think that I approach differently, which I hope to bring this into whatever journey I go on, is the fact that before I make any of those decisions, those decisions are usually determined by something else,
right?
Where I don't have to ask those questions.
Yeah.
And so my approach towards writing a program or an app, it should be, and I'm not saying it's AI, but when I look at a restaurant, I say, okay, what are you actually doing?
Right.
And before you start putting in equipment and things and saying, I want to cook here,
I'm
it's saying
all predicated on what you intend to do.
What I intend to do.
Yeah.
And I think architecting that first, then when you actually go in and you say, here's the equipment I need, you're not kind of guessing or trying to overbuild things for something you may not need. And so I think that's part of the efficiencies with me, is to write apps that allow you to scale, or to write apps that allow you to partner up with other apps for an integrated program at some point.
Yeah, there's a method of programming called Agile. And the whole premise is, and I could go on and on about what it is, but it's incremental changes is basically what it is. You don't over-architect things. You don't write code that you don't need right now. But you architect it in such a way that when you expand, it's not a big job, and that means that everything has a place. There are layers to it. And in a particular layer, if you need to make one change, it isn't going to break everything else. So that's the whole idea behind programming efficiency. So
Yeah. Yeah.
so let me just say that there are, with the .NET framework, and I'm just talking about the current .NET cross-platform or whatever. There's many different types of applications you can write. I'm going to share my screen right now. So here's one type of application, right? A console app. So this is just a command window, right?
Hmm.
It's no big deal. But people write console apps to do things at the command line that would be very easy to just do. There isn't an executable program, a Windows program. You don't need UI. You just need to say go do something. And when you install .NET, it itself is a console application, right? .NET. So that's all
And
I
so
did.
back up a second here. So a console app does what?
It can do anything. It's just the user interface is all text. It's all this,
But at a command prompt, right? You're looking at you're in the command prompt now.
Right.
And a command prompt usually runs a program at
Yep.
the command line and not like with a button or an app that has a.
You got it.
Am I saying this right?
Yeah, you got it.
So a console app is an app that runs something at the command prompt level, or
That's it. At the
okay.
command line. Yeah. So the user interface is this command line. So this is
Yeah.
a typical console application. When I type .NET, it says here's what the usage is. Options. .NET-H displays the help, right? I could list all the runtimes that I have. So I could say .NET list-runtimes. And there it is. Those are all the runtimes that I have installed. And those get installed when you're installing Visual Studio and you select what types of applications you want to build.
So what are runtimes? You'd like just take the first line.
So ASP.NET Core is the runtime that web applications use. .NET Core App is the runtime that any desktop or mobile app or non-ASP.NET Core uses. And then Windows Desktop is specifically for that, Windows Desktop.
Gotcha.
So I have
so
three
these
runtimes.
are so explain in layman terms what that is that you just
Yeah,
said.
sure.
So runtime, it's really what runtimes do, what they are. So give me a 30 seconds kind of
Sure.
lowdown on how I would explain that to somebody as a novice. How would I explain that to somebody who has no idea what programming is?
Yeah, when you go to install Visual Studio, there are these modules, right? That
Gotcha.
you can select. So I want to do ASP.NET and web development. I want to do Azure development, Python, Node.js, which is JavaScript.
Yeah.
Desktop and mobile. So .NET desktop development is for, desktop, Windows Forms, WPF, that kind of
Like
stuff.
Visual
apps.
Basic is an example of that. So
Yeah,
I could actually
Visual
run.
Basic is right there. You see it? It's an
Yeah.
option. Yeah.
So I could run. So the runtimes are actually what? What's another?
The runtime is, like I said, when you create a program and you have a process that is containing that program, the runtime loads in that process as DLLs, basically as libraries.
I got it. And so what
And
that
your
allows
program runs within the context of that runtime.
what we need to do is we need to come up with some funny kind of things for ourselves with languages, like say runtime is sautéing. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Or runtime is proofing your bread.
Yeah.
Now,
okay, so the runtime is your sous chef. How about that?
yeah, got it. See, and
So
now it all clicks.
Now it all clicks. Instead of chopping everything by yourself, you've already got something to do. So you tell your sous chef, "Hey, chop this," right?
So there are processes that are there to support whenever you're end up
Absolutely.
writing.
But the runtime is more than that. I think the runtime is your entire kitchen, because
Gotcha.
that's where you are. That's where
Yeah.
you're running, and the sous chefs are part of the runtime.
So in a program kind of model, making the references analogy back to the restaurant, which I'm sure because you're really into food, Carl. So
Yes,
it's kind
I
of
am.
easy and fun with this stuff
I'm
here.
a big foodie, but I'm getting smaller.
Yeah. So you would run, you would do a runtime that is your kitchen
Yeah,
if you're going to run something. But if I'm going to do a bar, I would have to run another runtime.
absolutely.
That's the bar. So
Yes.
those are the analogies that people say. If you're going to serve alcohol, you have to call up that runtime
Yeah.
called bar.
Yeah. Or more importantly, how about this? If you get hired to go to, I don't know, Ireland,
Yeah,
and you have you're going to be in an Irish kitchen, the runtime's got to be totally different because it has to support whatever
gotcha,
the standards are for that kitchen.
gotcha.
Yeah. So the runtimes that you can think of just simply are web, desktop, and mobile. Okay, that boils it down. Those three things.
Gotcha.
And of course there are more shades than that, but those are the three types of applications that you can create. And a console application is a desktop application. All right, so I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to ask you what type of program you would like to create in Visual Studio. You want to create a console app, a Windows app, a mobile app, a web app. What do you want to see first? Because it doesn't matter. Programming is programming, but I want to use it in a context that you understand.
So I would want to do something that's very relevant and interesting and not something that's really just static.
Sure.
And so it may have to help, like, what are the things that I do today? And like you always tell me, hey, Rob, I just wrote this app today
Mm.
that connects, different people from studios that they could share music in real time and blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
And so for me, I want to do something that kind of hits some of those points.
Okay.
So maybe you could help me determine. I can tell you some of the things that keep coming up in my life that are super cool.
All right.
So, and I'll tell you a few things. One is sharing information.
Yes.
The other one is a real-time database that I can pull information, share information. So managing a database is something that's important to
But
me.
what do you want to do? Give me a scenario.
Well, I want to.
Give me a scenario of what you want people to use, how you want people to interact with this program, and what it should do for them in specific terms.
So I mean, I don't. I mean, I can talk about business applications, and one of the ones is one of the things that I think I would look at is food, and not necessarily, but maybe an app that allows people to share recipes. And I don't mean like just recipes, but where maybe there's a database where people can come in and look at costing for things and then kind of like add data to something. So you would maybe use.
So it sounds right off the bat like a web application. Do you agree?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So web application would be good.
All right.
It's almost like you see the movie Christmas Story?
Oh yeah, love it.
So I feel like that's the point where the kid finally goes up to meet Santa after he's waited there all day.
Yeah.
And he gets up there and he finds him, what do you want for Christmas? And he's like, he freezes up.
And he's been practicing the Daisy BB gun.
Yeah. The one-eye red shooter or whatever.
All right. So here are the types of applications. I just clicked on create a new project, and there are templates in Visual Studio, right?
So this is Visual Studio that we're in right now, right?
Yeah. The pinnacle of web application development, and especially for anybody getting into it today, is Blazor. So there are two types of Blazor applications. There's a Blazor server app and there's a Blazor WebAssembly app. Here are the differences. There is no difference, barely any difference in terms of code, maybe some in configuration, but Blazor server, the code runs on a server, on a web server. So the user never gets any code in their browser or any significant code in their browser, which is usually JavaScript, right? Blazor WebAssembly is the opposite. The code runs in the browser. Now, there is JavaScript, but it's C# code. And so the difference is with the Blazor server app, it runs quicker, like it loads faster is what I meant to say. However, every user interface interaction requires a trip to the server and back, but it's very efficient. But the benefit there is the code stays on the server, so there isn't as many security requirements or issues, right? You don't have to have an API layer, which is a way that you can get from the web browser code to the server code to get stuff from a database, let's say, and bring it back. You don't have to have that. You can just read the database directly because you're on the server. WebAssembly, it's in the browser. So you do have to have extra layers for security and communications, right? For getting stuff from the database, let's say. So WebAssembly apps load slower. They're slower to get to Hello World. Are they faster? Marginally, but not anything anybody's really going to notice. Another interesting difference is a Blazor server app requires server resources. You know, a server app is definitely required. A Blazor WebAssembly app, a server app is required if you want to host data like an API, right? So if you're going to do that anyway, I always tell people that you should start with Blazor server, and then if you grow to the point where you want to scale up and you don't want as many resources running on the server, you can go to a Blazor WebAssembly app. So,
Gotcha.
so I hope that makes sense. A Blazor server is the place to start for me.
Okay, so let's back up again as far as the program goes. So
Sure.
I'll come up with an example that I want it web-based, and tell me if I'm saying this wrong.
Okay.
And so what I do is I have kids that come in from the nonprofit that I want to track time, track information. We talked about this little magnetic stripe reader, right? Yep, exactly. And so what I want to be able to do is to write a web app that I can use it anywhere.
Okay.
And then so somebody comes in and they use a card to swipe the card, and then there's data. That data is stored on a server, or I can upload, server information. So somebody can swipe it here in my physical location, or they can swipe it somewhere else. So I want the app to be a web-based app.
So
and not just
let me talk about that.
Okay.
So in general, you're not going to be able to read a USB card reader from a web app. In general,
Okay.
You're not. You're going to need some sort of bridge. And we've been working on this little thing, and I've found out that it's very complex in terms of the conversation and the protocol. The programming manual just doesn't do it justice. It's very complex. And so it comes with an app that you can use to read and write from files and to files. So we figured out what we want to do is just use that app, and then when it writes to a file, have another app that's watching that file that can load it up and do whatever, right? So you're going to have some local intermediary that is watching the files.
That's my point. So locally, you would have a physical swipe at any of those locations.
Right.
You would have to download the app. You'd swipe it, and then you would run through the program.
Yes.
Once it gets that, then I want to have a database that uploads that somewhere else.
Yes.
So that then you could download the information at another local place.
Yep.
And then communicate that way.
So your database is definitely going to be on the server.
Yeah.
And so now you have an infrastructure question. Do you want it running in the cloud? Which means that it's running on Microsoft servers, and you don't have to worry about updating the operating system or
I love that.
maintaining a server or anything. Or you run it on-prem. On-premises means you have a machine, a web server machine that you've paid for licenses for SQL Server and all that stuff, and you have to maintain it. And so we talk about those on-premises servers being like pets, right?
Yeah,
they require care and feeding. They require security considerations. You always have to be watching them. You have to be reading logs and figuring out if they're vulnerable for anything and if they need upgrades and all that. And then cloud web servers are more like cattle.
Yeah. Is that like Linode? Because we have a web server that we built that was a I think it's like Amazon web server. Am I saying this right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Amazon has a cloud. And Microsoft's is called Azure, and that's what I use because it's just easy with Visual Studio to.
Yeah, gotcha.
But you can use AWS with Visual Studio too.
Gotcha.
And Google has a cloud platform.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so let's go back here. So I'm going to create a Blazor server app. So the next thing I need to do is figure out where it's going to go and what it's going to be called. Pretty simple. I'll just call this Ramsay 1. How's that?
Love it.
All right. And now you pick the version of .NET based on what you have installed, your frameworks, right? So I'm going to select the latest, .NET 7.
And that is why?
Because that's the latest version that has all the latest features.
Awesome. There you go.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
why would somebody choose one that's lesser or newer?
Well, because they have code that they're importing that is running on a particular version. That they
Gotcha.
don't. Yeah, yeah.
Gotcha.
This is a way that you can do security right off the bat. Individual accounts means you're using an older version of Microsoft Identity. And that means that you'll have a database that has information for users and their password hashes and all that stuff. Microsoft Identity Platform is new. It's a newer version of that uses Azure AD B2C. And then Windows is just Windows Security, which I would not recommend. So those are your options. We're just going to say none here. This option right here, configure for HTTPS, always should be on. HTTPS is a secure HTTP protocol. So that means that everything is protected in transit. It's encrypted when you're talking to a website. All websites now, if they don't use HTTPS, then you're going to get a warning from your browser, right?
Gotcha.
It just should be on by default.
So you should have that on.
Yeah. Docker is another thing that I won't get into right now, but it's a way that you can, instead of using a server, you can create containers, which are little files that run on servers that sort of, you know, what, like I talked about what a process is to Windows. Well, processes take a long time to load and hydrate, if you will.
Yeah.
And Docker containers don't. They're very, very
So I have fast. A lot of, I don't want to say a lot. I actually have a lot of kind of experience in what a Docker is.
Okay, good.
So when we built our Linode servers, we created a bunch of different Docker containers.
Cool.
One to run our web, or host our website. One of them was our database. One of them was a different computer that was for data.
Cool.
And so, I get how that kind of operates.
Right. So we're going to use basically the defaults here and create. Okay. And so a Visual Studio template has already built into it a bunch of stuff that you can just modify, right? And the default Blazor server template, you can just run it right off the bat. Let's run it and see what happens here. All right, you see it right here. You have a hello world page. You have this interactive page counter that you can increment. And so this is just a demo of how you can write code that does something and then displays a result. And then here's a fetch data demo that it's dummy data. In other words, 67 isn't necessarily cool. Look, the same temperature is now hot.
Yeah, right? Sure. So this is just putting in some of the framework on what is possible. Yeah. So my question to you right off the bat is we started with a web app, or sir, what was the?
Yeah, this is a Blazor server application.
Yeah, Blazor server application. And so right now, this is, when you look at the, on the top of the browser there, it says local host. Right. So this is actually just within the local server, though. This is
you got it. Yeah, this is a local web server that comes with .NET. And,
gotcha.
Yeah, and it runs only on the desktop. Localhost is, if you want to know the IP address, it's 127.0.0.1, right?
And that's always by default?
Yeah. Yeah.
What is it again?
127.0.0.1. This next number is the port. There's a colon there, and then the port number, which is sort of arbitrarily created when you create the when you create the template, right? So what does this look like? Let's look at counter. So this is, if you click on counter.razor, this is what it looks like.
So in this panel over here, it looks like we have one is the program, Ramsay one.
Yeah.
That's the,
In the Solution
right?
Explorer, yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. So Solution Explorer, this is kind of like your,
Yeah, it's an outline.
yeah. And then so when it goes to pages, these are the different programs that you're
No, no,
running.
no. It's all one program. So
Okay.
folders are just a way to categorize the different types of things that are files that are in your app.
Gotcha.
But this is the convention that they use. They have pages in Blazor are routable components. The ones that are in shared are not routable components, but they're reusable, right? So
What's
look
the
at
difference between a routable and a shared?
this right here. It maps to a URL route. So
Gotcha.
when I click on this and I run it, and I go to counter and watch the route up here, counter/counter, right? So the Blazor system sees that in the URL and says, oh, that maps to this page right here.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Otherwise, there's not. Like checkout index, which is just the default, the
Yeah.
route is.
And so that's the syntax. It's the ampersand page, and I can't read
Well,
that.
the at
Is that
sign page, quote, and then whatever the path is.
is there? I can't read that. Is it an equal sign?
Nope. You see it now?
Yeah. So that's just a dot.
No,
Gotcha.
no. This indicates white space. That's all.
Oh, gotcha.
You see,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
right here.
Well, there you go. See,
Yeah. Yeah.
I would have been like, how do you type that button?
Yeah. So this survey prompt right here is a component that is not routable. So it's like a reusable component. So if I go to survey prompt, you see there's no at page up there. It's just HTML markup and code.
Why would you have something there?
Well, it's reusable. It's reusable. So you can write a component that does a very specific task, and then you can just
Call it up by
declaratively drop it into any page you want. Right?
Gotcha.
And so it has a parameter called title. If I change it, there it is.
Gotcha. Oh, that's so easy.
Yeah.
So you just do all these little shared things.
Yeah.
So what is that called under the shared? That's just a process. Like
These
what's
are components.
components?
But
Gotcha.
a page is also a component, but it's routable. So that's the difference.
That 100%.
All
I
right.
totally understand how all that works now.
All right, cool. So let's look at this code right here. We have scope for variables. Private means that only my page or component or whatever can access them. Public means anything outside can be accessed. If you look at survey prompt, this variable title is public. That means we can access it outside. It also has this attribute telling .NET, hey, this is a parameter of this particular component. All right. And so that's how Index Razor knows that title here is declaratively settable. If I take this off, right, and I go back here, it doesn't see the color changed?
Yeah.
It doesn't understand what that is. And if I run it, I think it's going to complain. Yeah. Exception. Objective type Ramsay shared survey prompt has a property matching the name title, but it does not have the parameter attribute applied. So the runtime here is actually telling you what the problem is.
So go back to this. So let me try to walk through this here. So you're going to go back to what we had. That was on the survey prompt.
Yeah.
And then the 2 hash marks, right? Because this is part of what we need to go through.
Oh, these are
the
comments.
2 hash marks are comments.
Yeah.
So when you do that, that's great. And then so anytime you do that, it's there. So what are you doing? You're defining the string when you say parameter.
You're defining this variable as a parameter so that it can be set declaratively.
Gotcha.
when you instantiate, or you basically tell Blazor to instantiate this component.
So survey prompt is under the shared,
Yeah, survey
right?
prompt is the name of it because the convention is that's survey prompt.razor. So that,
And the code that you're writing is under that survey prompt that we wrote. The parameter is a public string. So you changed that and you got rid of that, correct?
yeah, I got rid of parameter and then it complained.
So
So
you
now
just
that
put
I
it.
put the parameter attribute back on, everybody's happy.
So walk me through that line of code. What's happening? Go back to the
Okay.
survey prompt, right? So you're writing this little code at the end of, because normally it didn't do anything, right?
Yeah.
The survey prompt.
Yep. So all this is that, well, normally you see this markup right here, right? And then it puts, anytime you want to display code or a variable in markup, you just use at. So at title, all right? And title is defined down here as a variable. It's a public variable. It's a string type.
Which is text.
Yep.
But what you have right now is you have a survey prompt, you have a nav menu prompt, and you have main layout.
Yeah.
So you have three things underneath there that are doing some sort of thing that you can call up
Sure.
anywhere.
Yeah.
So what's happening is when you first put in this code down the bottom, demonstrates how a parent component can supply parameters.
Yes.
Right? You didn't type that. That was already
Yeah,
there.
that's in the template. Yeah.
Right?
I added this
What
comment.
happens in with a div? And so at the top of the div,
Mm-hmm.
on the very top left, on line 1, right? And then the bottom is where you're ending it. And so I understand that code because I've seen that before.
Yeah, this is markup. This is code.
Yeah. So markup does what? The div does what?
This is HTML. So div, span, strong, all these things are just raw HTML constructs that have been around forever.
So no idea what that is.
Div is think of it as just a division of the screen. Typically it ends and then another div, you put another div underneath it, it will go underneath it on the screen. A span does not. A span goes across but doesn't necessarily terminate.
So like I said, I'm still not sure why you need any of that, right?
Sure.
So right now you have div class. Are you defining something that's under class
All right,
equals?
yeah, I'll show you. So this is, you're bumping up against CSS. So let's talk about that. So here's what it looks like. And there's the code. All right. So this outline right here, you can see this box has some things on it. Like it's the corners are rounded, you see?
Yeah.
So that is a CSS thing. And
sure.
I think that's in Alert, and this is based on Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is a library of CSS or cascading styled sheet stuff, and it comes with Bootstrap, right?
Gotcha.
So a class.
And once again, CSS is more of what the design is. It's colors. It's,
yes. CSS is all about markup, about how
most people don't know that who've never programmed.
That's right. Yeah. And so you can have multiple classes here, and that's what we're doing. So some of these classes are defined in Bootstrap. I think MT4 is specified in Site CSS, which is the default CSS for this Blazor application.
That's the whole site. So when you define things in there.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Nope, that's not in there. So here's where it is. Main layout. All right, I'm going to take you through this whole thing, right? So let's just look at all this stuff. Where does it start?
Yeah.
It starts here at _host.cshtml. This is the page. So Blazor is a single page application framework, or SPA, meaning
say that again.
Single page application.
No, but Blazor is that okay?
Is a SPA framework. It's for making single page applications. Now, typically when you have a website and you have /this HTML or /that HTML, those are different pages. But there's really only one page. And then this guy right here, app, renders those pages dynamically as you navigate through them. But there's only one HTML page, and that's this. This right here is a link to the script that is required in order to support Blazor. So
Hmm.
this is Microsoft stuff, right?
Hmm.
But this is where everything happens right here. Now, this is a typical HTML file in that you have a header. The header has meta things about viewport and the base URL, and then it has links to style sheets. So this is the min CSS style sheet. This is our site CSS style sheet. Look at app. App right here is where your whole application is. And so this is the router. The router basically takes that slash counter and says, I want to look for something, a page called counter, right? And it looks through all of those pages and it says, I found it. And so then it shows a route view, which is the view of that particular page using this layout, main layout. And that's where main layout comes in. This main layout right here is markup for every page. So you'll see the page title, you'll see the sidebar with the nav menu down the side, and then you see this thing called main and a div that goes across the top that has an about link, and then the main page is body. You could take all of this and just do this. And this is what happens. Got me? So without that layout, it's sort of like a page template.
Yeah.
And every page goes into this. Now the nav menu is more markup in code.
And
right?
it's just really defining where stuff goes.
Yeah, so we have three
Right.
nav links, one to home, one to counter, one to fetch data. And then there's some code for collapsing.
Gotcha. So it seems like each one of those sections where it's div and then the syntax is between, what comes in between those two divs are specific kind of HTML code
You got it.
that's doing specific, you're setting certain parameters
Yeah.
for where stuff's laid out. So
Yeah.
normally when you do this as a template, the approach is it already defines what the page looks like.
Right.
And then you're going to go back and to customize and make those changes. You'd have to go in and change the HTML, which you would say, okay, I want to change the navigation menu.
Yeah.
So you would go click on the nav menu .razor. Right. And on the top, what that's doing, it's going down there and you could just search through there and like, I'm just trying to scroll all the way to the top. And let's just look at something from the beginning. So one of them is the top row.
Yeah, this is the hamburger menu right here. The navigation menu.
Sure. And so you can actually go in there. I don't see anything that says, how far over something is or.
Right. That's all defined in the classes. Yeah.
Right. And so where's that? When you go to the classes, where is that being?
So interestingly, there's a thing called scoped CSS right there. Navmenu.razor and then navmenu.razor.css. So all of these classes are only applied to nav menu. And that's where I was going with main layout. Main layout has its own, right?
So what you're basically doing is there's these subcategories down there that are, and I don't know what that little icon looks like with the color. You called it something.
Where? Here?
You can't see my screen. Yeah, sorry. Oh. So underneath main layout.razor, right?
Yeah, right here.
And then there's this, and then that's
a scoped CSS file. So that is CSS only to support main layout razor. So these classes right here only exist for that.
So that automatically, that's part of the template when it comes in that it creates that,
yes,
correct?
But you can create your own scoped CSS files for your own components just by naming convention. So if I added to this shared folder surveyprompt.razor.css, then I could add CSS classes that only applied to that survey prompt.
So how would you add that? And I know this might be getting ahead of myself.
No, that's okay. You can't see this, but because all right, in here I've installed this thing called new empty file. There you go. So this is a plugin that I've added, so I don't have to go through the elaborate process of selecting a type. I can just type the name right here, navmenu.razor.css.
Gotcha.
Whoops, that's not the one I want. I want
you want the survey prompt.
Yeah. Survey prompt Razor.css. Okay, so it automatically knows that it's a CSS file associated with survey prompt.
Oh, and so it's just because it's taking the exact same name,
Yeah.
and then you're adding CSS, and then it creates a subfolder.
So now I
And
can
then-
create a class here, and I can just say background color red, right? So now anything with the class foo is going to have a background color red.
And you just made that up. So
I just
go back,
made it up.
delete everything there, and just start typing it again from scratch. I kind of missed that.
What's that here?
Just delete the code, the HTML code, the foo stuff.
Oh,
When you
this.
first did it, it was blank. Yeah, just delete that. Now start typing it again.
Okay.
So dot something. So that's just your standard.
Dot means it's a class name. And then I created a curly brace, and it did the close curly brace automatically. And now I can just pick whatever properties, CSS properties I want.
And so you know that that's not coming from a library, is it? Or how do you know what I'm saying? So once you put background, and then all the library stuff comes down, like go slow.
Well, it's not necessarily all right. It's not necessarily a library, but
Start tapping background. So if I know it's background, now you can scroll down there and look background color, background clip.
Those are
background
standard
image.
Those are standard CSS properties.
Yeah. So that's what is that? That's what's super cool to me.
Yeah.
So you don't have to know. You just need to know, I want to do something with color.
Yeah.
And it's red. So if you do something with background file, it'll probably ask you to point to where the file is going to be stored, correct?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a great resource here.
And you're going to add these in the links, correct?
Absolutely. If you just do CSS color properties, let's say, W3 Schools is the first thing that comes up. And W3 Schools is where I get all of my information on markup and CSS and JavaScript. So if you look for, let's say, if you just go to W3 Schools, you're going to see all this stuff. Color names supported by all browsers. So those are colors. So here's the reference, right? Let's see. Let's do CSS background color. W3 Schools is usually the first thing that comes up here. So here's the background color, and then it usually has a try it yourself thing. So if I change this from coral to blue and run it again, right?
So theoretically, you could just copy and paste that because it's HTML, right?
That's right.
To the left. So copy and paste all of that.
All right, but you don't necessarily want to overwrite the stuff that you have, but you could create, a class. This isn't a class. This is saying that the whole body of my application is going to be background color pink.
But so for example, if I wanted to do that at that level for the program we wrote, because what you're looking at is you're going to survey prompt. That's not a page. That's just something that's calling up.
Yeah, you're right.
And so you're going to create a class that turns the background color in any one of the pages. So you can call
Do you see
that
this
up
right here? This is site.css. So this already has for the body and for all HTML.
for the whole site.
This font family here. So I could use this and just add that like so. Now it's going to be pink.
Cool.
But W3 Schools is your source when you don't understand how to do something in CSS or JavaScript or HTML.
Yeah, and then you have that other cool program that you told me that you just asked it a question.
Oh, ChatGPT, yeah, that's amazing.
It's what is it?
ChatGPT. We'll talk about that, but I think this is where we ought to stop today.
Yeah.
And when we get back into it, because we did a lot of webby stuff that we didn't really even touch code yet, so.
Yeah, but I think this is kind of a good overview. And so one of the things that I think some of the feedback that I would give you for what we should look at, you go back to, well, yeah, there you go, is I think we really need to look at, not just what I want to learn, but I think there is a lot of people that are interested in learning a little bit more about coding. I think it's almost like the sim rigs and the racing. People don't want to get in a real car. They want to get a taste of something, and then they might like it, and then they might get into it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I want to take a more layman's approach towards how do you really get somebody into coding? But
Totally.
yet I don't want to start from the beginning and saying, here's how you actually type, or,
Yeah.
here's how you load the program.
Well,
Like that to me.
I think this was a good start. I mean, basically,
Yeah.
you had questions, and we're starting at, the tools that we're using and what's in it, and how do we modify things, and we're peeling the onion bit by bit.
So I think rather than looking at a big program, something that I think would be beneficial for me is to start, the conversation with, what point can I just start writing a regular app? So what I could
Like
do
a
now is
console app would be the simplest type of app.
well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a web app.
Okay.
And so what I'm going to do is take what I learned today, and I'm going to create something based upon moving colors around. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, Carl, look what I did.
Yeah.
And you're going to say, that was absolutely terrible.
Great.
Right. And then what we'll do is we'll have a good conversation about, what some things mean. So rather than just trying to learn from the very beginning,
Yeah.
you could say, okay, well, here's where you're struggling, or here's something that you can actually do.
Sure.
And so now you can go back and I could look back at some of these chapters that we might have done saying, oh, wait a minute, I forgot how to do this. It's kind of the framework of how they do these masterclass things where you can kind of pick and choose topics
Absolutely. Yeah.
based upon these series. And so what
Like
the first
Blazer
thing
Train, for example.
Blazer Train, love it.
Yeah.
Do you know anybody who does that? I've seen a couple of videos that produced on
some
that.
guy with a crazy hat.
Yeah. So maybe what you could do is why don't you share some links with me? I'm going to download on one of the computers that I don't have, because I know we have the what is it? The
Yeah,
Visual
Visual Studio. Yeah.
Yeah, .NET and Visual Studio. So I need to download those. So maybe what you could do is send me a link with everything step by step what I need to download. Visual Studio, .NET. I love the idea of the plugin. We talked about the plugin. And then
If you just Google download Visual Studio and download it, you're going to get that Visual Studio installer. And when you go to run that, you're going to pick all the different modules, all the different workloads that
you can edit this. You can edit that. You can edit this part out later on.
No, I don't think so. This is good to know.
But no, what I'm saying is I want to get in a workflow where you're actually listing it so that when we post it, there's a people can look and say, hey, that's great. Go to the below and I'll click all the links. So somebody watching can say, wow, that's how I do it.
Sure. All right. Cool.
Yeah. So let's do that. Send me the links on that. I'm going to play around with it and just see like what I can waste my time doing rather than working for a living.
That's great, man.
So anyways, Carl, I appreciate the help, the support, man. You've always been a godsend for me in my business. So
yeah, well,
you know what you're talking about.
I enjoy teaching, so this works out for me too, and hopefully somebody else will learn from it.
Perfect.
All right. See you later.
All right, man.
Bye-bye.